My name is Nam. I'm from Hyperlane. And yeah, I'm here to talk about why intents are still bridges. I also have a bit of misfortune that I feel like it might look like a copy from the rest of the talks, but I swear I did not. But I do end up somewhat similar storylines. But I'll start with, intents seem like the best thing since sliced bread. I don't think we've ever had this broad consensus on something being this good, honestly, in a while. And especially I think even in the early days, people seem to be all very focused on oh yeah, this is the solution. I don't even know that we talk about many other things besides intents to solve the cross chain. Everybody recognizes bridges are bad. Let's move all the risks to solvers. They're professionals. They can deal with this. And yeah, I think not trying to call out specific people, I definitely think that's a very commonly held view. Is basically intents are here to solve users from the need to ever think about bridge risk, right? That's all done by solvers. And I think one thing that I find, I guess, as a developer of a bridge, I find that striking because in a lot of ways, I believe all of these people are still building bridges, and I think it's important for all of us to be honest with ourselves if we're doing so or not. And so yeah, it's always all of us solvers, right? That's always the one thing that we all kind of just punt the problem to. But the question really becomes how do solvers get repaid? Andrew just gave us kind of a high-level overview, so I won't get too much into detail. But it's always the last step. And whenever we talk about intents, we always say oh, and then the solver fills, and then somehow they get repaid. But we never really talk about okay, what does that actually mean? And I know Viva, you also mentioned this a bit in your talk, but right, my view here is that that settlement, right? I think Uniswap X calls them settlement oracles. I think Across itself is a settlement oracle itself. Ultimately, those are really just people building message bridges, right? There's a specific message bridge that has different trust assumptions, and I think we've had the history of the last 4 or 5 years of most message bridges getting hacked in one degree or another. And so I understand why people don't want to call it, hey, I'm building a message bridge. But let's say even if you take that aside, that settlement of these intents, is ultimately building a message bridge, you can still say well, look, the user, right? There's only two parties that have to be exposed to this, right? The user to some extent, but then really the solver. But like Andrew just mentioned, there's significant solver centralization, and I just took this post from I think the Li-Fi research post as well. And I think part of the reason why is because it sucks to be a solver, right? I think most solvers are effectively run by the core teams of these intent protocols, and at least I have not yet talked to a solver that isn't one of those. And so the question becomes again why? And this is where again borrowing from Andrew's point, where it's very hard to be Wintermute and hold all of this different inventory on all these different chains, right? Crypto is still it's a massive industry, but still. Very few of us know how to deal with several $1 million all across and know how to price risk, right? I barely know how to use a DEX. There's I think definitely a lot of help that solvers need to be able to actually manage all this inventory. And so practically speaking, as far as I can tell, there's a lot of projects, a lot of us here in the room, right, working towards basically separating the responsibilities of a solver from the solving in terms of just the computation of hey, what is the best path? And then the liquidity provisioning, basically the holding of liquidity and inventory, which can be put on chain, similar how Uniswap kind of allowed us to move liquidity on chain by passive LPs. And so yeah, so there's a bunch of liquidity-based projects that basically aim to help solvers. But really the question then to me comes again who's helping those LPs, right? Because ultimately the LPs really delegate that risk to the LP developer, and then the developer of the LP protocol has to figure out, okay, cool, how do I think it was basically your question, right? How do we rebalance those pools? How do we say that something actually happened on a remote chain, and that's ultimately still building a bridge. And that's kind of the main point I want to make is that we cannot ever get around the fact that somebody has to attest to some remote chain state. And I think there's a lot of very interesting work done by especially roll-up teams, but ultimately, right, like also a bunch of the ZK teams to like get us better proof mechanisms to basically attest to remote chain state. But I think we should never forget that when we're dealing with these intents, that like somebody has to kind of bear that risk of that kind of like settlement oracle to basically fail. And so that's kind of like the main point that I basically want to kind of call out, is that like a lot of these like, again, protocols ultimately built message bridges. And I feel like if I've learned anything in the last 2.5 years of building one of these, is that like, if you can, you should avoid doing that. Like it's definitely, like a very painful endeavor. I guess as the last slide, hopefully not too shilly, like this is basically what we do, right? Like we focus on, I think basically Vibe of your point of like, hey, we just don't believe there's a singular proof mechanism that is the best for all of these kind of use cases, which is why we've modularized the verification mechanism. And we just believe that it's hard enough for us to kind of like implement all of these different proof mechanisms, roll-up bridges, into kind of like a consistent developer interface that people can use. And so, if I'm a friend, I don't want you to do the same effort. So let's work together to kind of like share the same tooling. Like kind of my inspiration for this is really like Kubernetes, right? Like this is an open source thing. Like I think sometimes we have a bit trouble like having people think that like, ooh, like you really just want your thing to become a standard so that like you get to rent extract. I think my point here is that look, everything is open source. You can deploy your own instance very easily. There's like docs for everything. That all we could do is basically like save the development costs, right? Or like share, right? Like even just having like multiple eyes on the same thing. I think that's just like would help us all tremendously, instead of us all dividing all to build basically the same implementation of a proof mechanism and all these different kinds of developer interfaces. And so I'm gonna leave it there. Thanks.
All right. Thanks.